Good evening. Welcome to tonight's presentation, Digging the Trenches, Battlefield Archaeology in France and Belgium. Welcome to Westminster Libraries. This is a co-production with Kensington Libraries. We're very glad to have you, especially it's great so many people are turning out or staying in when the pubs are open. Tonight's guest is Alex Sutherland. He works for the Ministry of Defence and also for Sheffield and Rotherham Wildlife Trust, so quite a portfolio of interests here. He's going to talk for, I think, about 45 minutes on battlefield archaeology, First World War battlefield archaeology. We'll try and get as many questions in as possible afterwards. So please type in the Q&A any questions you've got. And over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Nikki, and thank you to everybody for obviously coming very far for this evening's talk tonight in this terrible weather. I do appreciate it. As Nikki said, I do work as one of the archaeology advisors for the Ministry of Defence. I also work as a community archaeologist with my other hat on for the Rotherham and Sheffield Wildlife Trust up here in South Yorkshire. I've been an archaeologist for about 20 years, and in that time, since about 2003, I've been involved in battlefield archaeology in France and Belgium, hence the title of this talk tonight. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk to you about some of the sites that I've worked on. I'm going to go through 3 different sites. I'm going to show you some of the kinds of things that you will probably find as an archaeologist in France and in Belgium, specifically on First World War sites. And then just wrap it up with, well, one final site look later on. And as Nikki said, this should be probably about 45 minutes to an hour or so. And of course, happy to take any questions of anything that comes up. One thing I just want to say just before we do start, there are images of skeletonized human remains in this talk, just so you're aware of that. They will be coming up. I just don't want anybody to be taken by surprise. So the area that I'm talking about largely mostly tonight is going to be the Western Front, and this is basically an image of the Western Front of 1914 to 18. I took this from the internet. I can't remember exactly where I got it from, but it gives you a good idea of the line of the trenches that kind of sat between the late 1914 through to early 1918. And although it's a line of trenches, there was a lot of movement. The Western Front wasn't as static as it is sometimes made out in the popular imagination. You can see where there are large areas of movement where it says the German withdrawal to the Hindenburg line, for example. But the areas that I'm looking at really of the areas I've worked largely have been around Ypres, which is up in the north in Flanders, in Belgium itself, and also on the Somme as well, and around Arras. So these are the areas I've kind of worked around, but the Western Front itself was about 500 miles long, all the way from the English Channel right the way down to the border with Switzerland. As I say, I've only really excavated I've been involved in excavations of a very small part of it. The first site that I'm going to look at tonight is Thiepval Wood. This is you may know Thiepval itself from the name of the memorial to the missing on the Somme. It's a huge memorial. It's the one that is always shown whenever they talk about the Somme itself. It has the names of, I think it's 72,000 British and Commonwealth servicemen on there, inscribed on there, and these are men who have no known grave. That's not to say that they are not buried in cemeteries, in the Commonwealth War Grave cemeteries on the Somme, but they are unknown. They were known to be in the army, but their remains were never identified. And the area that we're looking at in particular is Thiepval Wood. You can see here from this map. This is a trench map from 1916. You can see the British front line in blue running down the centre, with the German trenches, front lines and rear support areas in red there. Now, this map looks as though the British only have a single front line and the German trenches are a lot more developed. This is not the case. The British lines would also be pretty similar to the German ones. However, this map would have been carried by officers probably into battle, so they wouldn't have mapped their own lines onto it in case it fell into enemy hands. But it was an indication for the attacks when they went forward on the 1st of July 1916, which was the first day of the Somme. And the area that we're looking at in particular for this site is Thiepval Wood. You can see there almost in the centre in square number 30. And this is where the 36th Ulster Division attacked on the 1st of July 1916, 7:30 in the morning, after a week-long bombardment on the German lines. The area that they attacked is now home to the Ulster Tower Memorial to those men. You can see here, this is a replica of, I think it's St. Helens Tower, which overlooks the training area there, where they trained in Ireland. Because obviously they're from Ireland if they're Ulster. And this is directly on top of the German front line. So this has been ploughed out, and then this memorial was put up in, I think, 1922. And it overlooks the attack area. So just to go back, I'm going to try this again. It didn't work earlier, the laser pointer, but I'll see if it does work this time. So we're somewhere around about where my pointer is in the centre there, where it says cemetery, looking down over onto Thiepval Woods, and the Irish attacked across these areas here. In 2004, the Somme Association of Northern Ireland took over ownership of the Ulster Tower Memorial, and with it they also bought Thiepval Woods itself, and put together an idea of excavating some of the frontline trenches in the woods, because this is where the Irish, there still remains of these trenches that you can actually see when you're walking about in the woods. And you can see here 3 of the guys actually excavating these trenches. We were there working 2 times a year from 2004 all the way up to 2013. We were just shy of our 10-year anniversary of working in these trenches, a lot longer than the men who originally dug them were there for anyway. But we basically followed we excavated and followed the original front lines, and you can see where they're excavating down into the trenches themselves. So we followed these with our archaeological knowledge. We were excavating as though they were, say, like a Roman ditch or a medieval ditch or something like that, and retaining all the finds, recording everything as we went along. And as we excavated further and further, we were able to actually see the shape of the trenches as they were underground, or at least on the ground level. And you can see it has this slight crenellation here as it comes round. This is not a zigzag, it's actually a crenellation. So there's a slight forward fire bay in each of these areas here. And you can see that it then comes back round. The reason for this, and the reason that it has this crenellated shape, and when I say crenellations, I'm talking like the top of a castle, you know, the castle battlements. The reason it has this is because if something fell in it, like a grenade or a shell, then the explosion would be located in one small area. It would be dampened down by the fact that it can't go around corners. Also, if the enemy were to jump into the trench, actually capture it, they wouldn't be able to fire rifles down. You would only be able to fight in these small areas. So it's all about defense. It's all about thinking about, you know, enemy attacks and that kind of thing. And this is how the trenches of the First World War evolved. They weren't literally just ditches in the ground. They also had rear areas where you would have support trenches behind, and then connecting those would be zigzagged communication trenches, such as this one here, which we were currently in the state of revetting it. So you can see the zigzag of this one, and the communication trenches were used for moving between the front lines and the rear areas. They would be used to bring up stores. They would be used to take the wounded back. And also when the battalions were changing over in the trenches, because most battalions would only spend about 4 days in the front line, and then they would also move their companies in the battalions between the front lines and the rear support areas, and then they would all completely move out of the trenches after about 4 days if there was no major attack on. So they would be using these kind of trenches, and the communication trenches were one-way systems, so you would go up one, come back down another one, so people didn't get caught up. Because they were quite narrow, again, just to be able to dampen any issues like explosions or shells or things going off in them. And what you can see here in this particular photograph is the team are revetting the trenches. So we are basically repairing them, because Thiepval Woods is open to the public. You can only visit it, it is private land, you can only visit it if you go to the Ulster Tower Memorial and book a tour in. The tours are free, absolutely free, and they do, I think, 2 a day, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. So you can jump onto one and actually go around and see these trenches. Obviously, COVID has put a bit of a dampener on it, but at any other time you can go around and actually see these trenches and get a tour of the woods. And you can see what we're doing here is revetting them, so we can interpret these trenches and show the public how the men were fighting in 1916, or at least the areas. And you're probably thinking, yeah, but they're using modern materials. Well, the materials that we are using to revet those trenches with, the chicken wire, etc., and the sandbags, they were all actually found through the excavations. So everything that has collapsed into the trench that was used at the time, we've actually found it. And we found that they were using chicken wire, they were using things called expanded metal, which is basically sheets of metal with holes punched in it, so you would pull it out. And they revetted the sides of the trenches in order to keep them stable, so that when the shells went off, they wouldn't collapse in. And also just the fact that the trenches themselves are steep, they need some kind of support just to stop them falling in naturally. And this is an ongoing job. It's something that every year there is a team out in Thiepval Woods who are repairing the trenches, because they do keep collapsing. You know, these things were only meant to be used for a very short period when they were originally dug. So us having had them open for what, getting on for nearly 20 years now is way beyond their lifetime. So this is that same trench, just looking back from the other direction, just to give you an idea. So I'm standing up on the path there, looking back down this trench, and you might be able to see, again, if the laser pointer is working here, there's a little entrance here with a couple of metal stakes. Now these stakes were actual original revetments, and this was a little gap that led down into this area here, which has collapsed, which was a dugout. Now this was an old French dugout, because the Thiepval Woods was part of the French area until 1915, when the British extended their line and the French units moved out and the British units moved in. And this was a really old dugout, and it had actually collapsed, possibly from shell fire, possibly just because it was weak, but it was quite a shallow one. So it's quite an early one from a typological point of view, from an archaeological point of view. Because early in the war they dug what they called cut and cover dugouts, which was literally you would dig a hole in the ground and then you would line the top with planking, with wood, and then on top of that soil to try to dampen the explosions. But as you can probably guess, these things weren't particularly stable, and as artillery got bigger and better, it was easy to destroy these dugouts, so they had to start digging dugouts that went a lot deeper. And the good thing about the chalk on the Somme, because this is a very chalk, you can tell from these photos, everything is white. The chalk is very good for drainage. It's also quite stable as well when you get down into the actual solid chalk itself. So digging, and it's soft as well, is the other thing. So digging down into it wasn't particularly difficult. So dugouts started to get a lot deeper. I mean, you've probably heard that the German dugouts on the Somme were very deep, which is what helped them survive the artillery bombardments in the weeks before, which is very true, but also the British ones were equally deep as well. We don't just have the frontline trenches as well, we also have some of the other remains within the woods. As I say, this woods was used basically throughout the war. It was fought over quite a few times from 1915 onwards. The time that we're looking at particularly is the 1916 stuff, but there is, you know, all the way through the First World War, we get remains and datable items from everything, from every year in the war. This was a particularly interesting feature. This is a toffee apple mortar pit. And what you can see here on the photograph on the left is a photograph, a still from the Battle of the Somme film, which was filmed during the first day of the Somme, and also in the lead up to it as well by Malins, the official photographer for the British Army at the time. And he and his team, they filmed all different kinds of activity on the lead up to the Somme. They also filmed, you will have seen the footage of the large mine exploding. He filmed that at Hawthorne Ridge, sorry. And he also filmed this toffee apple mortar being loaded here, and you can see it. This is the explosive part, this is the actual mortar. So these things were loaded in, and then they would be pulled with a lanyard, which was round the corner. And what you can see is that the pit itself is very, very similar. Obviously, we've re-revetted it, very similar to the original from 1916. And we know it's a toffee apple mortar pit because right at the bottom of it was a toffee apple mortar bottom. It was actually just sitting on the floor, the base of the mortar itself. So that was quite nice. Gave us a really good idea of as what it actually was. And you can see also the crew quarters and areas are down here on the right hand side, and this is where the lanyard would have been for the crew to fire the mortar. These were used, as I say, as part of the actual week-long bombardments on the German lines prior to the attack on the 1st of July. So there would have been a mortar crew in here firing at least for a couple of days before the attack went in. Interestingly as well, we also found a bayonet had been driven into the wall of the trench here, and this was used probably just to hold somebody's coat up while they were working. You can see these guys in this photo are working in their shirt sleeves, so they're probably taking tunics off and they would need to put them somewhere. So somebody's probably put a bayonet into the wall and hanging the tunic off it.
Alex,
yes.
Alex, can I just want to interrupt. Nothing wrong with your talk at all. It's all going swimmingly. Just let you know your pointer isn't actually working, so you're going to have to say just by that the third leaf on the right or something.
Okay, right.
So sorry about that.
I shall say that's I'll take that. I don't. Okay. I mentioned that we find a lot of materials, and we certainly do. There is a lot of things come out because the First World War was a material war. There was, millions of shells were produced. They had to house and clothe several million men throughout the war. And there's also lots of material that gets sent from home as well, because the postal system in the First World War for the British Army was incredibly good, because they knew it kept up morale, people getting parcels to the front and letters and things, and they were passed very quickly between the front lines and people at home. One of the things that we found at Thiepval was this. Now, unfortunately, I can't ask the audience what it is. I normally do, but this is in this. Obviously, the seed tray is a modern seed tray, but this is an old thermos flask. You can see the actual ribbed metal outer line of it, and also just the eye of the top as well. And it had glass in it, so it was an old glass metal thermos flask. Obviously, this is not military issue, but it was probably sent to somebody. You can just imagine somebody having a warm drink out of that, probably the very famous sugary tea that the soldiers drank that also tasted a bit of petrol as well, because it was brewed up in petrol cans. And of course, we have military finds. This, for example, is a button cleaner. So this would be slipped over the buttons on the tunic, and then they will be brassoed up so you don't get brasso all over your tunic. And it's also, you can see it is stamped with number 9 RIR 3789. So 3789 is the soldier's number. The 9 is the 9th, I think, battalion, and it's either Royal Irish Rifles or Royal Irish Regiments. We're not entirely sure, but one of our team, Steve, he's an expert in finding people through their First World War records, and he was able to track down the 2 guys that this could have been. Apparently both of them did actually survive the war anyway, but they probably got a dressing down from their sergeant for losing their button cleaner, if nothing else. Another interesting small fragment as well, just to show, the I suppose the basic humanity of the trenches really, and this was an interesting thing. The €2 coin is there just as a scale, but what you've got is the back end of a British 303 bullet, excuse me, and it's had an indelible pencil shoved into it. The indelible pencil being the purple bit on the left-hand side. Now, when we found this, it was raining and the indelible pencil was wet, and it actually went all over everybody, whoever handled it. We basically got our hands covered in this stuff. And so some bright spark has obviously just picked up an old used bullet, a fired bullet, and decided to stick their indelible pencil, because this would be used to mark maps or to write notes and things in notebooks on the front line. And they've used it so it's not going all over their hands. I quite like that, the fact that you've got this little piece of military equipment, but it's been used completely against its type, if you will. Okay, the next site I'm going to talk about here is Bullecourt. This is down near a place called Arras. This is the project I've been involved in since, it's 2016, 2017, I think. 2017, I do apologise. And this is Operation Joan of Arc, and it's run under the Operation Nightingale banner, which is a Ministry of Defence archaeological scheme where we get veterans involved in archaeological work. And one of the things that we do is we go out and we work at this place at Bullecourt. This was attacked by the British and the Australians in 1917. It was a diversionary attack as part of the Battle of Bullecourt. First attacked on the 11th of April of 1917, then again later on. You can see the Google image on the right-hand side is on Bullecourt village as it is now, and it was actually defended by the German Hindenburg line, which was created in late 1917. The Germans fell back to this line after the Battle of the Somme. They basically gave up a lot of the territory they captured in the years previously and fell back to this, what they thought was going to be a strong line of resistance against the Allies' attack. And you can see on the picture on the left-hand side just gives you an idea of the trenches running around Bullecourt. So the grey area is the German rear areas, the red area is the British and the Australian areas. So they were attacking over these fields. The Australians attacked with the support of 11 tanks, 11 Mark II tanks, one of which was this one, Tank 796. This was commanded by a Lieutenant Skinner. It managed to get across the field, but then was taken out by German artillery fire or anti-tank fire, and the crew had to abandon it. This was then later turned by the Germans into either an observation post or a machine gun post. We're not entirely sure, although a large target like that is probably not going to be a machine gun post, because it would quite easily attract a lot of artillery fire. So something a bit quieter, like an observation post. But this shows you, the photograph here is a German photo of the time, and is taken after the Battle of Bullecourt. But it kind of gives you an idea of the terrain that the Australians were fighting over, the flatness of this area, and also just the churned up nature of this battlefield because of the artillery attacks. And I mentioned that Operation Nightingale basically deals with veterans suffering from various combat-related injuries, such as PTSD or even physical injuries, and it serves on a pathway towards recovery for the participants. Archaeology is great for this, because you really need to have a very a great amount of attention on the job that you're doing. You can kind of lose yourself in it, because you've got to work on a very small area. You've got to, you've got to be working methodically. So it really helps from a mental health point of view. I'm not saying, it doesn't cure anybody from PTSD, but it certainly helps on pathways to recovery. And a lot of the guys, it is mostly guys who have been involved in Operation Nightingale projects, have gone on to do other things in archaeology, or even come back to other Op Nightingale projects. And some of them have gone on to university, and some of them now work as professional archaeologists. So it does show, you know, that you can go from one career to another completely, really, with just that little bit of help. These photographs, I must say, were taken by our site photographer, Harvey, which is why they're much better than the rest of the photographs in this presentation, because he's a professional photographer and I'm not. But at Bullecourt, we were in this field here. You can see this is just on the edge of the village, and we were laying out trenches here. So I was just teaching them how to lay the trenches out. We'd done a geophysical survey of the area, so we basically just chose the best site within that field that we thought would be of interest. We were kind of looking to see how much of the tank 796 remained, but also to see if we could get any of the German Hindenburg line and investigate that from an archaeological point of view. And to be honest, it didn't take very long before we started finding tank pieces. There was all sorts of little bits coming up. We kind of knew this would happen because if you've got a large lump of metal that's been hit by artillery, then lots of those little bits of metal are going to come off everywhere, and you're going to end up with little lumps, if nothing else, here, there, and everywhere. And one of the things we found were these two strips of metal that you can see. The little greenish thing is a bullet, so it gives you an idea really of the kind of the size of this thing. We cleaned it back, we cleaned around it, and lo and behold, it was 6 foot length of a British tank. Now this is sorry, British tank track, should I say. So this is the tank track. You can see the individual plates. You can see that the metal rods that we had before, just to go back, so you can see that they were actually the driving rods underneath the plates for the track itself. The large thing sticking out at the top of it is what's called a grouser. Now these were added as part of to improve grip. They would be added every few track lengths, and they basically just gripped into the soil and were able to pull the tank along itself. It's something that is used in agricultural machinery. But as you can see, the scale we have there is a 2 meter long scale, and the little black and white dots were there so that Harvey could take some photogrammetry photos of it. So we were able to then take a GPS point reading of each of those black and white dots, so we would be able to place this in time and space perfectly. So this was fantastic, amazing. It's probably one of the best things that I've been involved in finding in my career on the Western Front, so to speak. But what was even better was the fact that there was still the original paint on it. And you can see that there, you can see the red primer, and then on top of that, you've got green, a dark green paint. Now, it looks like it hasn't really been affected by the passage of time. You know, it's been underground for 100 years, but it's obviously some kind of something in the paint that has kept it at the level it should be. And Harvey was able to take that paint and analyze it for what Pantone color it was. And as you can see there, it's Pantone 560C, which I'm sure everybody knows is, you know, you all know what Pantone 560C is. It's, you know, it's pretty close to British Racing Green. So what you've got to think here is you've got this vehicle that does no faster than 4 miles an hour on good going, and it's painted in British Racing Green. I think there's probably somebody somewhere taking the piss. That said, it's probably because these tanks were produced in agricultural factories, first of all, largely in Lincolnshire, and they would have probably most likely had this kind of paint just sitting about, so they probably painted them in green. This is long before they were experimenting with tanks and camouflage and that kind of thing. As I say, this is a Mark II tank, and it was a training tank anyway. What I didn't mention is when the attack occurred on the 11th of April 1917, it was actually snowing as well. So these things would have been tracking across snowy ground, painted in pretty dark green. So there was no wonder that they didn't really get very far, because any German gunner that couldn't hit that probably really needed to reassess his trade, I would have thought. But we had the indomitable Didier, who is a tenant farmer of the area, he came along with his tractor and he helped us lift up the tank track, which was fantastic. So we got to see both sides of it. This now resides in another barn of the owner of the land, and he's talking about turning it into some kind of museum with all the bits and pieces of the tank track that we found. So this happened on the Thursday of the excavation. We were supposed to be finishing on Friday to be leaving on a Saturday. So basically, all we needed to do really was just clean up, just make the last few records of the site, you know, tie a few loose ends up, just really just seal the deal. You know, we'd been there, we'd found the tank, we'd lifted it up, and everything was great. However, with archaeology, there's always the thing that you always find, well, the best things on the last day. And I don't know if these are the best things, but we certainly found the thing that threw the spanner in the works. And that was the remains of 2 German soldiers. And you can see them here. You can see an incredibly rare photograph of myself and Richard Osgood both working. Richard is my boss at the MOD, who's also the director of this excavation. This is literally a blink and you'll miss it moment. But you can see that these 2 soldiers were laid directly underneath the tank track. We, you know, saw the bones straight away. So when you find human remains in archaeology, you have to deal with them, really. I mean, we called the police. They came out. They said yes, they are First World War. They're not modern murder victims. So we were able to continue. But we had to deal with them, and we had to deal with them pretty quickly as well, because, as I say, this literally happened on the Thursday night. Now, the interesting thing that happened here was that we didn't have any security for the trench or for the excavation, because, you know, we were working under limited funds. And I've worked on sites in the past where we've worked until 11 o'clock at night on First World War sites, gone home, come back in the morning, and in the morning, or in the after we'd left site at 11 o'clock, somebody had been up and down the trenches with a metal detector and pulled out all the metal, and basically ruined any chance of possibly identifying any human remains that we were to find. So we didn't want that happening here, of course. So Richard asked if any of the veterans would volunteer to stay on site, and every single one of them said they would. And on top of that, the French villagers in Bullecourt, they'd been coming to the site, and, you know, they were very proud of what we were doing. They were really interested, because obviously it's something that's happening in their local area. It's a tiny rural part of France. Not only did the veterans stand up and say, yeah, well, you know, we'll stay on site and look after the site, but the local burger van opened up. He brought his burger van over and fed everybody. And then somebody turned up with a load of tents. This is from the French village. They turned up with a load of sleeping bags. And then somebody turned up with a load of booze. Now, veterans and booze obviously don't mix, but, you know, it was a really nice little gesture from the people of Bullecourt, just to help the guys along overnight. So we were able to actually excavate the 2 human remains you can see there. One of them is face down. One of them's laid on his side, kind of in a fetal position almost. The chap who was laid on his side, excuse me, the chap who was laid on his side, we determined that he was probably around about 35 years old. There are various bones in the human body which fuse at various times, and you can kind of get a rough age of somebody from their bones, but certainly up to a certain age anyway, the late teens. And this chap, most of his bones are fused, apart from the ones that were around the age of 35. The other body to the top of the photograph there, the one laid down first, he had what were called unfused epiphyses. Now, they are the ends of the long bones, so your femurs and your tibias, your leg bones, and they fuse in your late teens. So his being unfused meant that this guy was somewhere probably between about the age of maybe 17 to 19. Unfortunately for us, neither of these men had any insignia on them, so we couldn't even get a regiment for them. We knew they were German because they had German buttons. They also had German jackboots. You can see there on the right hand side, that's the remains of one of the jackboots, and other various military equipment that basically pointed to them being Germans. So we knew they were German, but we couldn't get any more information out of them, unfortunately. However, underneath those two was a third body, and we went back to Bullecourt in 2018. We also went back in 2019 as well, but in 2018 we went back and we were able to actually uncover this chap, because we just ran out of time. We had to cover him up, and we had to basically put plastic down and then refill the trench on top of him with a marker, so we knew where he was, a GPS marker, so we knew where he was. So we knew in 2018 we're going to go straight back to the same place, get straight down to him, and then recover this body. And we were able to get him out of the ground, and his skull was pretty intact, as you can see here. And what's happening here is we also had with us Isabel from Face Lab, which is a facial reconstruction company out in Liverpool. And Isabel came along with us, and she brought her 3D scanner, so she was able to actually build up a 3D scan of the skull immediately as we'd literally taken them out of the ground. And from that, Face Lab, and these photographs, the next photographs are from Face Lab themselves, they were able to reconstruct the face of this German soldier, at least. So this is their reconstruction of him. Harvey, our photographer, was able to turn him into a sepia photograph, which you can see on the right hand side. So it's a bit of it looks like a period photo from 1917. Now, obviously, it's impossible to know what colour his eyes were. It's impossible to know if he had a moustache or not, but a lot of German soldiers did. It's impossible to know what colour hair he had. But it's an interesting idea that you can take some human remains, which are just skeletons in the ground, literally, and basically, put flesh onto them. So that was a really nice thing. Unfortunately, we were unable to name these guys. They are all buried in Metz Cemetery, Metz German Cemetery, which unfortunately is quite a few hundred miles away from where they were found. But that was the only place that was taking German casualties at the time. So they are buried with their comrades, just not close to where they were killed, unfortunately. But they'd been underground for 100 years and were finally in a military cemetery. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to turn away from the sites. I'm going to talk a little bit about the kinds of things that you would normally find on any particular First World War site. So I'm just going to show you some of the kind of stuff that we find, the interesting artifacts, as it were, and then I will turn to the last site and talk about that. So this we have here laid out on the tarpaulin. This was found at Gelderveld in Belgium. This is a British Army trench coat. You can probably just make out the back panel is the center panel. The two front panels are the two on either side. You've got the belt and also the arms as well, and some of the pockets. The reason that this was in I say such good condition, but in pretty good condition for having been underground for 100 years, is because Belgium has a very high water table, which is the thing we think about when we think about the trenches in general, is that they are muddy, they are claggy places full of clay, and Belgium certainly is. And that helps from an archaeological point of view, because it helps to protect cloth and things like that, but metal, unfortunately, because of the water content of the water in the ground, it will rust away, but cloth and things is preserved really well. We get the opposite on the Somme, because the Somme is chalk, and as I said before, chalk is really good drainage. So metal survives really well on the Somme, but cloth doesn't, because it just rots away underground a lot easier than it does in Belgium. So it's very interesting to have those two different types of levels of preservation in two areas that are pretty close together geographically, really, but geologically are completely different. This is a piece of classic early First World War material. This is the eyes and the flutter mouthpiece of a early PH hood gas mask. This was worn over the head as basically as a sackcloth. It would have the two holes, the two eye holes, and the flutter mouthpiece was held in the mouth to breathe through. This was soaked in a particular chemical that kept out chlorine and phosgene gas later on. Because when the Germans first used gas in 1915, there was no protection against it. The British soldiers who were under gas attack had to improvise, and they started using face masks and things like that. So it kind of replicates what we're doing now, I suppose. But then very quickly, the gas mask was developed, and it was able to combat gas if it had been worn properly. So you basically take this, you put it over your head, tuck it underneath your tunic, and breathe through the flutter piece and look through the eyes. Now, the thing with gas is, if you're able to get your gas mask on, you're pretty safe. And men were trained in to do this, and they were, you know, it was the thing that there was a lot of emphasis put on gas training, especially in the First World War. Later on, there's better gas masks to develop. The smallpox respirator, for example, is developed rather than this thing. But the problem with a gas mask is that wearing it really disorientates you, because the ice will steam up very quickly, so you can't see anything. You can't hear anything because you're trying to hear somebody through cloth. Also, it's very difficult to breathe in it anyway, just because you're only breathing through this small hole. It's very claustrophobic, and I know this because I've worn one, and they are pretty nasty things. So having to wear one and also fighting one was a real undertaking. So gas was really used as an area denial weapon. Also, it was used to tire soldiers out, so they would fire gas shells at artillery batteries, for example, so that the artillery had to fire their guns in gas masks and make it much more difficult for them to do that kind of thing. And also, it was used as an area, I said, an area denial weapon, so it was used to cut off areas that would be attacked, because attacking into a gassed area was also equally difficult for soldiers, again, wearing gas masks. So far from the image of everybody drowning in their own lungs, you're generally going to get a lot of images of men wearing gas masks more than anything else in the First World War, but just being incredibly tired and disoriented by them. We also find as well, as I say, various weapons and things. These are British bayonets, found these at Thiepval, dropped for various reasons. But one on the bottom is unscabbarded, unsheathed, and you can see there are scabbard remains on the other. So you can see there that leather does survive pretty well in these conditions, even underground, as I say, for 100 years. We get a lot of this kind of material because people are just dropping it. The wounded may drop it, or just the men are dropping it on during their service at the front lines. We also get bits and pieces like this as well. This is, I think this is actually the only British helmet that we've ever found, this, the team that I've worked with. This is a Brodie helmet. This was again found, I think, at Thiepval, if I remember correctly. This was in the old dugout. And this was in particularly good condition. I didn't take a photo of it, but on the other side, you can see that it did actually have the leather straps still in place as well for it. So this was a really nice find. And we also find, you know, pretty domestic things as well, like this. This is a brazier. So this would have been filled with coke or coal, just to keep men warm on the front lines. And probably also to cook the breakfast bacon as well. You can kind of imagine people huddling around this in the trenches on a cold night as they're doing sentry duty. Food-wise, we find lots of sets of knives and forks and other bits and pieces that show that men were eating whilst they were serving in the trenches. This is the snapped knife at the top. You can see where the blade is broken. You've also got the fork at the bottom as well, where the end is broken off from that. And we do find quite a lot of these. I mean, soldiers would rarely drop these if they could, because you know, you don't want to lose your only way of eating food. But sticking with food, again back at Thiepval, one of the things we found was this, which normally at this point in the proceedings, I would ask the audience what they think it is. unfortunately I can't, but it is actually a British Army biscuit. Now, this is a biscuit that's 100 years old. So you can still see that it's in pretty good condition from when it was dropped. It's also a biscuit that was found in the remains of a fire. So not only has this thing been underground for 100 years, but it's also been burnt, which probably gives you a bit of an idea of how inedible these things actually were. There were several Tommy recipes that they produced that actually turn these things into edible material, but this one has survived, you know, for 100 years, literally underground and having been burnt as well. So I think you break a few teeth on that. Domestically, we also find things like this as well, socks, although this one appears to have probably belonged to Coco the Clown. Somebody probably couldn't stop knitting when they got down to the foot part of it. This was found at Gellerveld. You can still see the stitching in it, the weave in it, and this really leads me on to talking really about trench foot. Again, another one of the perceptions of the First World War is that a lot of soldiers got trench foot. Early on in the war, they certainly did, but I mentioned that the trenches in Flanders were below the waterline. They were initially below the waterline. Later in the war, they basically dug what were called breastworks, where you would only sink the trench itself into the ground only maybe half a foot or so, and then build up the rest with sandbags, just so you were above that waterline. And this is because trench foot is caused by people standing in water for a long time. So it's like basically when you have a bath and your fingers go wrinkly, it's that, but writ large basically. And one of the ways of dealing with trench foot is basically to dry your feet and just to keep them out of water. And this was very quickly realized, as I say, early on in 1915 or so. And to deal with it, the soldiers were then given extra pairs of socks, one of which they wore, and the other one they would dry by putting them basically on their shoulders under their packs. So they always had a clean, dry pair of socks ready to swap over. There was regular foot inspections by the Royal Army Medical Corps, who would come round and make sure the men's feet were good, because obviously it's debilitating having trench foot. And trench foot actually became, having it actually became a military offence, simply because it could be avoided. And sticking with the Medical Corps, this is a small file of bromide. This was carried on in first aid kits. You can still see the staining of the bromide itself. And if, like me, when you were a kid in chemistry lessons, you used to throw this stuff on your mates, you know that it gets everywhere and you can't scrub it off. But it also acts as an antiseptic as well. So this really shows that first line of defense against getting wounds in the field, and also the whole triage system that came about in the First World War. So you've got the first aid, which is administered either by the soldier themselves when they're wounded or by somebody else who is on that front line. They are then taken by stretcher bearers if they can't walk, or if they're heavily wounded. They are then moved to what are called advanced dressing stations, which would have been set up just behind the battle lines. Their wounds would also be dealt with. If they were particular cases, particularly bad cases, they would then be sent to the casualty clearing stations, the CCS. So you've got that triage system, as I say, which is still in place today in modern medicine. From the CCS, they would then either go to a field hospital, or they would probably get sent back to Britain for further treatment if that was required. Now, if a soldier was wounded in the First World War in the British Army and they were able to get to medical help, that advanced dressing station, or their chances of death dropped to 10%. So they were able to save 90% of the men that came through the medical facilities. So it was a really good setup from that point of view. And as I say, it's like the foundation of the modern hospital and medicine system. But of course, obviously, I mean, we do find weapons. This is a pistol. This was found at Loos in a German mass grave. There was at least 6 or 7 sets of remains in there of Germans that had been placed in an old trench. One of the things that one of the guys had was this. This is not a military weapon. It's a private weapon that's either been sent from home or the guy had brought it from home. Whether he ever used it or not is a different matter. And sticking with the Germans there, we have the classic Pickelhaube. This went out of use in 1916. It was a pre-war dress uniform. This would have been covered in a cloth, a field grey cloth, but obviously that has rotted away. But what you can see on the front of it is the Prussian eagle and the spike as well. So this would have been used as part of military parades and that kind of thing. But the men were wearing these in the front lines. They dumped a load of these at Loos, probably because they took on what was called the Stahlhelm, which is a classic German coal scuttle helmet that you'd recognize immediately. So these things were no use anymore, so they dumped them. They were actually highly prized as souvenirs by the British and French, and there's lots of photographs of the British soldiers after successful attacks wearing these kind of things that they're basically stolen from the German stores. It's quite an interesting sight to see. And also there's some incredibly personal things that we find. This was also found amongst the remains of the soldiers at Loos, the German soldiers. This was in one of the guys' tunics, and you can see what it is. It's actually 2 British bullets and a French bullet that's been carved and turned into this little leaf motif. Now, it's interesting, you know, it's also got a little hook as well on it. So whether that was hung around the guy's neck or hooked off a bullet or something, but it seems to be some kind of little token. Whether a good luck token or not, we don't know. But it kind of harks back to Blackadder and Baldric saying, you know, if there's a bullet when he's carving his name onto a bullet, and he's saying, if there's a bullet with my name on, I'm going to keep it, so it'll never hit me. It's the fact that it was found on a German soldier, and it's made up. It's a piece of trench art made up from a French bullet and 2 British bullets is really interesting. The fact that he's found those particular items and kept them. And I can see questions coming in, but I'm not looking at them. But I'm fairly certain people are probably asking, what kind of dangers do we find? Well, we do find a lot of dangerous material, of course. There's a lot of shells and things that never went off. The big stuff, like anything from a grenade upwards, we generally have what we call EOC cover, which is explosive ordnance clearance cover. So we have within the team some guys who are trained in this. We have Steve, who is an ex-military policeman. We've also had military EOC with us as well on site, and they deal with anything that we find that we think is untoward. We generally, what we do is we will take the material, the explosive or whatever it is, and it will get placed in a safe place, and then the French demiers, they will come round and they will pick it up and take it away, and they will deal with it. One of the things that we found, or I found, should I say, at Thiepval, are these White Star gas canisters. Now, when you're out working with a lot of Irish folk from Ulster, you spend a lot of time drinking into the wee hours. And that's what I was doing the night before I found these. And I hit them with a mattock, hit one of them with a mattock. It made a dung sound. So I hit it again, made another dung sound, hit it again. And then I thought, maybe I should stop doing this. And we cleaned up around it, and it was these White Star gas canisters. Now these, I mentioned before about gas. This is basically a mix of, I think, phosgene and chlorine gas, and these were used as a battery to blow out into the German lines. This is incredibly dangerous, because if I had taken the top off one of these, the gas would have been released, and we probably would have been killed because we weren't wearing gas masks. It's probably the closest I've been to death on any of these excavations, and touch wood, the closest I'll ever be as well. And you know, I kind of shudder thinking about this, even all this time afterwards. But we had to shut down the woods. They had to be removed with a mechanical digger, and the demiers you can see there have come to pick these up. This was taken by Carol, who runs the Ulster Tower Memorial, and she sent this photo through to me at the time. And as I mentioned, the demiers, they take all the shells and the ordnance that are found in these areas, because it still gets pulled up by the farmers. Now you can, if you drive around during ploughing time, you'll see piles of shells left, right, and centre all over the Somme in particular. And these guys, they basically take it away, they make it safe, they destroy all the material, and they are working their way through it. They currently have, I think it's about 350 years worth of work ahead of them. So if you want a job for life, that's probably the way to go. Okay, I'm closing in on the end here, don't worry, wake up at the back, we're nearly done. I'm going to talk to you now about the last site, and then just wrap up from there really. This is a site, one of the first sites that we actually worked on. This is back in 2003. This is a place called Serre, and if anybody's been out to the Somme, they may know Serre Road Cemetery number 2. Also, from a local point of view, from my point of view, it's where the Sheffield battalions, city battalions, attacked in 1916 during the Battle of the Somme. Not on this particular area, but just a little further down the road from here. The line of trees that you can see at the back of this photograph is Serre Road Cemetery number 2. It's the largest one on the Somme, as I say. The white tent was where our excavation was, so we were literally right next to the cemetery. And this was on a German frontline position called a Heidenkopf. This had been fought over by the French in 1915, the French and Germans, and then again was attacked in 1916 by the British during the Battle of the Somme, the first day of the Somme. Now, the reason we were excavating here was because the BBC had got in touch with the team. We'd been working at another place, Ocean Villas, for a couple of years, and the BBC got in touch, and they wanted to make a programme called Ancestors, which was a runoff from Meet the Ancestors, if anybody remembers that, from about 20 years ago. And it was with Peter Owen, who was the grandson of Wilfred Owen, the famous war poet of the First World War, who I'm sure everybody has heard, at least heard of, if not read his poetry. Now, Wilfred Owen had served in this area in 1917. He'd been in a dugout, a German dugout, with his company, and they'd endured a German bombardment. He said it was the worst 50 hours of his life. He went on to write a poem about it called The Century, and he talks about being in an old Bosch dugout. So the BBC, in their wisdom, asked us if we would go and find Wilfred Owen's dugout. Now, I probably don't need to tell you, there are probably millions of dugouts on the Western Front, so the chance of finding it was pretty minimal. I do say that Steve, a historian of the team, thinks he's actually found his proper dugout, but we did actually find a dugout, and you can see it here. These are the steps heading down into it. We didn't excavate any further because these things are pretty dangerous once you get below ground. They're unstable, they can collapse, and accidents can happen. So we didn't excavate any further, but the BBC were very happy. They found, we'd found this dugout. We had Peter Owen there. He was on screen talking about it and how he felt and all the emoting that goes with the First World War. We also found the German front line itself, and you can see here the remains of the trench boards that were pressed into the ground. So this is the part of the Heidenkopf that was attacked by the British on the 1st of July 1916. And on top of this, just above it, in the backfill of what were mine explosions, the Germans had set mines in front of this position. They dug mines underneath the ground and they exploded them as the British attack came in on the 1st of July. And on top, and they'd actually backfilled the German trenches at the front. And on top of that backfill was this soldier here. It was a British soldier, and you can see this is 2 photographs of him. I do apologise for these photos in this section. This is long before archaeologists could afford digital cameras, so these were all taken with an old disposable camera, which I then digitised. So the pictures aren't great, I'm afraid. But you can see his legs and his pelvis. He also has some coins in a pocket there, the little greenish, bluish things. And then on the photograph on the right-hand side, you can see he's also got a gas goggles. He was also carrying a PH hood gas mask, similar to the one before. He'd been killed by a shell splinter. There was also other wounds on him as well. There was possibly been killed by a hit to the head, but he'd been hit in his femoral artery, which is the top of your femur, so your hip, and that the shock and the blood loss of that would have most likely killed him anyway. And as I say, he was literally on top of the backfill of these mines. So we could almost pretty much date this guy's death to probably about 20 to 8 on the 1st of July 1916. He was subsequently excavated and lifted, and he is now in a grave in the Serre Road Cemetery number 2. So he's literally about 200 or 300 yards away from where he fell. There was a full military burial for him, and of his unit. Now I'm struggling to remember the name of the unit, to be honest. So I'm not going to embarrass myself by telling you the wrong one. But from his unit, the historians in our team were able to get 62 men who were missing from his particular unit on the 1st of July 1916. So all of those names were read out as the remains were lowered into his grave. So although he doesn't have a named grave, he does have a regimental grave, and he also was at least named during his funeral. So that was quite a nice end to him, at least, having been laid under in a French field for 90 years. However, close by, we also found the remains, another set of human remains. This chap here, you can see he's got collars, cuffs, buttons on the end of his arms. He's also got leather equipment around his center, and you can see buttons as well down there. This was a German soldier. Now he'd been killed in 1915 and been buried in a shell scrape or a shell crater just close to the Heidenkopf, and we were able to excavate him fully. And you can see here, unfortunately, his head was missing, but this has probably been taken off from the plough. Since the 50s, there has been deep ploughing, and it basically removes the top 2 feet of earth in any field. So this guy's head had probably been taken off in the intervening time between him being buried and the farmer reclaiming his land. But you can still see he's wearing his jack boots. He still had his tunic on. He's got his leather equipment, and as I say, a German soldier. He'd also got a couple of personal items. On the left-hand side, you can see this is the top of a hair treatment, a pomade, and this was produced in a place in Stuttgart. The E. Brunninger factory and the company still exists today, though I'm not sure what they produce, but I don't think they produce hair treatments anymore. But this was a small tin lid that he kept. He'd also got on his right-hand side, on the right-hand side photo there, you can see he'd also got his dog tag still. Now, if you don't know, dog tags are identification discs. The British ones are made of fibre, were made of fibre, so they disappear, so we very rarely get them. The German ones are made of tin, so although they are rarer, you still can find them. And this guy, we'd found his. This was then sent off to, I think it was UCL, University College London, and their labs there, and they were able to actually point out that you can see the white writing is where he's actually scratched his name, and it says M-U-N, so Munster, H-O-N-E-S, Honnes, J-A-K-O-B, Jacob Honnes. So we've got a name of this bloke, basically because he'd been able to scratch his name onto his dog tag. So the historians of our team were able to look into the rolls, and Ralph Whitehead was instrumental in this, and he said he was coming tonight, and if he is, then thanks for the information here, Ralph. He, or at least the team, were able to pull together this photograph of Jacob's company, and laying down in the front on the side there is Jacob himself. So from an archaeological point of view, to be able to actually excavate a skeleton, not only name it, but then get an actual photograph of the man who you've excavated is incredible. His family was still alive. His descendants were still alive. His son was actually still alive. This is back in 2003. His son was, I think he was 92 when the team were able to contact them. And he was told of where his father had laid for 90 years. And then I think he was only about 3 years old or so when his father had been killed in 1915. Jacob was 34 years old when he was killed, and I think he had 5 children. There's a couple of postcards between him and his wife that exist as well. And the son, as I say, was He actually died 6 weeks after the team got in touch with him. So it's almost, you know, I'm not a superstitious kind of guy. I'm very much a realist, but it's almost as though he was waiting until the end of his life to find out what happened to his father 90 years before. So again, from a team point of view, that was incredible to be able to do that from an archaeological point of view as an archaeologist. But the story doesn't end there. We also found quite close to Jakob another set of human remains as well. This is another German soldier killed in 1915. He was actually of the same unit from Jakob, so probably killed in that same French attack. And he was laid on his side, you can see here. His bread bag, which the German soldiers wore on their hip and usually had rations and things in it, also contained a few items. And you can see those here. These are in situ, so this is up against his hip. We recovered those. We've got a fob watch. This was stopped at 6:10. Now, it's tempting to say, is this the time he was killed? Have we actually got the minute of this guy's death? But who knows? Did the watch actually wind itself down? You know, was it still going for a few hours after he was killed? And is it 6:10 in the morning or 6:10 in the evening? But it's still, a really nice archaeological find that you can actually put a moment into. Really, it's a real snapshot of history. He also had as well in his bread bag a shaving kit, which you can see the two pieces, the left and right pieces there. He also had a harmonica as well in there, which you can see at the top. And this item as well in the center, which blew us all away. Now, again, I normally ask the audience what this is. I can't in this situation, so I'll just tell you, it's a prehistoric worked flint. Now, I mentioned that the Somme is an area of chalk, and it is full of flint because that's where flint comes from chalk. And I'm an archaeologist. I've been an archaeologist for 20 years, and my speciality is not flint. I wouldn't be able to tell you what worked flint was if somebody threw it at my face, to be honest. It's just a piece of stone to me. So for this guy to actually be able to not only notice this but recognize it and keep it as a prehistoric keepsake almost means that this guy probably had at least some kind of possible training or interest in archaeology. So we had this really strange situation of a bunch of archaeologists excavating a fellow archaeologist from 100 years previously. And that is not the only strange coincidence that happened here at Serre. We were able to name this guy as Albert Thielke. He was born in 1888, killed in 1915. Again, this is work done behind the scenes as part of the history. And a story was run by the German historian that we were in touch with, who also helped find a lot of this information out. And it was run in the Stuttgart Zeitung, which was a local newspaper in Stuttgart, about both Albert and Jakob, and just asking an appeal for anybody who may knew any family connections with these two chaps, so we could kind of follow it up. And a Susan Thielke got in touch with the team through the various things. And it turns out that she was actually a long lost relative of Albert down, I think, her father's line. And so we were able to get some family information off her. Now, the interesting thing with Susan is that she wasn't a Stuttgart native. She was actually in town because she was directing a play, and she'd been shown the article in the local newspaper by an American actor who was in this play. And the play that she was directing was actually based on poems of Wilfred Owen. Now, what a bizarre coincidence that we had been looking for Wilfred Owen's dugout, only to have her direct a play about Wilfred Owen. Incredible. Now, unfortunately, as I say, Albert was killed. He'd had a brother. The family house in Stuttgart had been bombed in the Second World War by the Allied bombing. It flattened it. And one of the very few things that actually survived and that's taken out was this photograph of a youngish man of about Albert Thielke's age in First World War German uniform. This is literally scorched at the edges because of the bombing that it had gone through, but it had been saved by Albert's brother. And there's a very strong possibility that, again, the photograph, like the photograph of Jakob, this is a photograph of the man that we'd excavated at Serre, our fellow archaeologist. So with that in mind, from that archaeologist and from this archaeologist, thank you very much for listening.
Wow, that was amazing. Just so many interesting stories there. We've got lots of questions. Before we start, I will say this is being recorded, so because we're overrunning a bit, this is being recorded. So if you can't stay for the questions, you'll get sent a link, probably not till tomorrow morning now. So you will be able to catch up. So so don't worry about that. Okay, loads of interesting questions. I'm going to start with one. Frank Heron has said, how soon after the war did archaeologists begin to make the first formal explorations? And this is why I love these question and answers, Maura Cross has said, has replied and said, there's a regimental magazine from the HLI, I guess it's the Highland Light Infantry in Glasgow, and there's a humorous article in it speculating what archaeologists in 2017 will find on the battlefield. So
that's brilliant. I've not heard of that.
So, but I mean, when did this start?
Well, it did actually start in the First World War. There are the trenches that were dug are the largest excavation trenches ever dug. And the amount of archaeological remains that were found during the First World War is incredible. And some of them were really, really well preserved and recorded, because a lot of the soldiers were actually interested in archaeology, as our guy Albert was. There were also set up, a couple of units were set up by the various armies to look after the antiquities as well, that were pulled out during trench digging and things. And I've seen some of the excavation reports, particularly the German stuff, and they are really, really good high-level archaeological excavations. In modern times, there is a massive gap between the end of the war and then it really starts. Battlefield archaeology kind of really starts around the late 90s, early 2000s. There was, I think, probably one of the main group were they called the Diggers. They were a volunteer group who worked out in Belgium for a few years. There was a TV program about them by Channel 4 about 20 odd years ago. And they were probably the first ones, but they weren't strictly professional archaeologists. So I'd like to say that the lot of the archaeology of the First World War was kind of bypassed by the French and the Belgian archaeologists until the 1990s, really, because it was more intrusive. But battlefield archaeology in the last 20 years has really become or should I say conflict archaeology has really become a discipline in itself. It's really taken off, especially since the centenary anyway. But some of the first actual methodically archaeological excavations that happened in France were ones that were done by the team that I joined when I joined them in 2003, but they've been doing it since the late 90s. And we were just a bunch of interested people who were interested in military history and interested in archaeology. You know, half the team were professional archaeologists, half the team were just volunteers. So that's kind of where it starts, really. But as I say, nowadays it's very different. The French and the Belgian archaeologists really treat it as they should, as an archaeological layer, basically, across their countries. If that answers your question.
I hope so. I mean, several people have asked if members of the public can volunteer for these digs.
Well, that really depends on the dig completely. It's hard to say, really, because the work I've been involved with Operation Nightingale and Bullecourt, that is staffed by volunteers. But we generally take veterans, because that's what Operation Nightingale is all about, with a few other civilian helpers as well. It's really just a case of getting in touch with the teams that are working. The team that I was involved with, we've kind of, I suppose we've kind of petered out a little bit. We've not been out to France together as a group for a few years now, so that would probably be the better way to get onto it. But as I say, we've not really done a great deal of work for the last few years. There are occasionally things come up like Dig Hill 60, which was a Belgian excavation run by Simon Verdigan and two historians, Peter Doyle and Rob Schaefer, and they excavated a large area that went on for a couple of months, I think, and that was largely volunteer led as well. So they do come up occasionally, but they're quite few and far between, really.
Not a question, but John from the Bradford World War I group says, we were 4 Brits walking the area who turned up on your last day and really appreciated the opportunity to see the human remains at Bullecourt, and we've kept quiet about it ever since, as requested.
Good, thank you.
Laura Gork says, what's the legal situation concerning archaeological finds in that area?
Yeah, in France, it belongs to the landowner, really. I don't know if they have a similar treasure trove law as we do in the UK, where anything that is classed as treasure is owned by the crown. In France, it's basically the landowner owns it. Interestingly, in those areas, pretty much every landowner is a farmer, because they're generally rural areas, and every farmer has a barn, and pretty much in every one of those barns is absolutely stuffed full of First World War material, because they just pull it up all the time when they're ploughing. So it generally goes to them. A lot of it, to be honest, is just rust and dust. We will record and catalogue everything, so we have a record of it, at least on paper, but a lot of it will just be thrown away because it's useless. There'll be little bits and pieces, interesting bits and pieces that are kept, obviously, but in general, a lot of it will be tipped.
Yeah, something actually, probably if you send it to me later, Laura Gorks asked if there's any introductory reading to battlefield archaeology in general you could recommend. If you want to just email, if you want to just drop me a line,
yes,
afterwards, and then I'll put in the link that I send out tomorrow. Rather than you just kind of reading out things. So I'm scrolling up and down the questions because they're all really interesting, but I'm not I'm not doing them in order. Someone, and I missed who it is, but someone says, what are the current military interested in what you're doing, but also have you ever found anything that you shouldn't have done?
Are the military interested in? I'm not sure what you mean. I mean the veterans.
Yeah, just what degree are they interested in the finds?
Incredibly.
And have you in the actual finds? And have you found anything you were not supposed to find?
Yeah, the veterans are very interested because their bread and butter when they're serving is equipment. You know, so they are able to. They can see literally the stuff that their forebears were using 100 years previously. So to them, it's a massive interest, and just because the thing that we do with Op Nightingale, because we're dealing with military veterans, is we try to do military sites as well in the UK as well as in France, so they have that connection because that is you're first in straight away as somebody who's served in the military. It's interesting to see how the military served in the past. So yeah, they have a massive interest in it, and I mean they wouldn't be there volunteering if they didn't in the first place. As for have we found anything that we shouldn't have, apart from the gas canisters that I've found, I don't think so. No, not that I can think of off the top of my head, to be honest. I mean, we find unexpected things, but there's nothing that we shouldn't have found. I mean, I'm assuming that somebody's probably thinking something about, I don't know, like a murder victim or something. We never found that or anything, or at least not to my knowledge.
Okay, I'm going to wrap up fairly soon because we're kind of overrunning, but just a couple more questions. Julian Webber says, when excavating, how do you decide when to stop? What makes you decide not also to uncover the next meter or the one after that?
Discipline. That's it. Discipline. You have to stop. You've just got to. The trenches that we dug in Thiepval, I didn't mention it, but you may have seen that we'd actually got sections cut into those. So you could actually, you know, that's literally where we'd stopped for that season. We'll clean those up and then we record them. So we got a detailed plan of a drawing of the way that these things have been backfilled, so we can then work out where the different finds have come from and things. So we just have to, you just have to basically say, right, okay, this particular season we're only going to do 2 meters of this trench. We just need to know a little bit about it, try to find some dating from it, try to find anything like trench furniture, so you can see how it was made. You can see, then you can see what the function of that trench was. You can see what the different bits and pieces within the trench were. And as I say, dating is pretty important. We try to get that from, I didn't mention it, but every bullet that you find has a head stamp, and every head stamp has a date from its production on it. It's in various different, I think the Germans is possibly by month. The British head stamps might be by quarter of the year, but you always get the year at least. So you can tell approximately when there were men in those trenches and when they were being used. So we're kind of looking for that as much as just digging and digging and digging. I mean, if my job was just to dig the front line from the Belgian coast down to Switzerland, I'd be a very happy man, but I know it's never going to happen. So, you know, you basically just have to say, right, we're stopping at this point right here. We've got enough information out of this right now.
Morag has also added that if people are interested in archaeological excavations, the BAJR, which is British Archaeological Jobs Resource online, is worth looking at because it lists upcoming digs.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm just going to round it up with one last comment, which is from Sid, who says, thank you, Alex. My maternal grandfather joined the army in 1914 and was gassed just before the end of the war in 1918. He survived, but I realise now he had PTSD all his life. He was in the Somme, was a stretcher bearer, and was removing the bits of men who were his friends. This was a very good talk, and it will mean something to those of us who had relatives who fought in the war, which I think we can all agree. I mean, my grandfather was in the First World War too. So thank you for this. This has been an absolutely brilliant talk. I've been fascinated by it. You're going to get sent the link so that you can watch it again and also see the questions I'm afraid I didn't have time to ask. And please do book for some other talks. We have one tomorrow on the history of food and drink emporiums in London. So we've got quite a variety going on. So thank you, Alex. It's just brilliant.
Oh, thank you.
And good night, everybody.